Then I did a spin to the right, and this time it went into a flat spin.
Just on two, clear takeoff, left hand. Takeoff left, left left, spin west, copy.
Hello and welcome to the Blueskies podcast. I'm PR Ganapathy, your host. Well, folks, I hope you joined me last week to listen to the experiences of Wing Commander Joseph Tommy Thomas as he flew the Dakota and the Packet and the Photo Reconnaissance Canberra. This week we pick up the threads with Wing Commander Thomas as he tells us about his journey to become a test pilot at the US Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base and his experiences as a test pilot on his return. Anyway, welcome back to the program, sir.
Yeah, okay.
If we can change gears now to test pilot school, how did you get selected and go to the US, and what was it like to go to the Mecca of test flying, the place where all the men with the right stuff used to get together at Edwards Air Force Base?
Yeah, first I would like to say that a test pilot is somebody who's a link between the engineers and designers and the operational pilots. So we're a link between the two. See what is happening and report on that. So basically, a think and fly. You're not necessarily what you have termed the right stuff and all that, and you're not necessarily very good pilots. You should be, should be reasonably all right in flying, but you should have the knowledge of what is happening and be able to interpret it and be able to explain it to the engineers and the designers. And so really you're a link between the two. So that is the first thing. And I was interested in test flying right from the early days. So I presume that was there in my reports and all that. Now, the little bit of background, during the 65 war and immediately after that, the British and the Americans put an embargo on us. And in those days, Britain was a great power, and we were, in any case, Indian Air Force was formed in British times, and we inherited a lot of things from them. And so we had close links with them. And the first two test pilots were sent from India to Britain for training in 1948, Suranjan Das and R.L. Suri. And after that, we used to send maybe 1-2 pilots a year. And they were the ones who flew with HAL on deputation. And also, when we introduced the NAT in 1957, we formed a NAT handling flight in Kanpur because the development of the NAT was not complete when we bought it. So in the early days, it was all on the HAL flying and the NAT development. Our testing establishment, known as A-NATO at that time, developed on that. But after 65, Britain stopped giving us vacancies. So by about 70, 71, we had reached a crisis because our test pilots had become older, more senior, and we faced an acute shortage of test pilots. And people of my seniority, as it is, we started out flying and all that in 62. So there was a 62 war, 65 war, and there was a big expansion of the Air Force immediately after us. So we were slightly more experienced than the newcomers, and we were always in demand. And we couldn't be spared for anything. But by about 1970, there was an acute shortage of test pilots, and Air Headquarters decided on two things. One, they sent out a message to all our air attaches all over the place to somehow find vacancies for test pilot courses. And secondly, they decided to start test pilot training in India. So two parallel tracks were there. So our air attachés got a vacancy each in England, France, and USA. So then squad leader, later Air Chief Krishnaswamy, was selected and sent to Britain to the Empire Test Pilot School.
Right.
Then squad leader, later Air Marshal Philip Rajkumar went to France, and I went to US. And we were just basically the same seniority, 6 months difference between us. And
Right.
I went to Kanpur AST for some familiarization on fighter aircraft and what aircraft they had there, like Kiran and Avro and all that. Going to US was quite an experience because I was the first to go there. And so we really didn't know what to expect and what to get over there. Fortunately,
Right.
I had no problem with the language. My colleague Philip Rajkumar had a big problem with French because he just got a few weeks training in French and then he was sent over there. So he had two tasks, one to learn test flying and French. And anyway, he managed. Okay, so I went to US and Edwards Air Force Base, and these days with satellite images, you can see it. It's a huge base. Huge is not the word for it. There are 300 miles or 500 kilometers of roads inside the base. So that is the size of the base.
Right.
It was 18 miles or 32 kilometers from the main gate to where we were in the housing area. And I said, as I said before, India in those days was ruled by clerical level people. You know, the allowances were so few, so little that I couldn't manage over there. And there was, you know, in America in those days and even now, everybody has a car and everybody drives around in their car. And the distance was not walkable or anything like that. I mean, you were talking of 18, 20 miles within the base.
Right.
So I had no money to buy a car. And with the foreign exchange restrictions, I couldn't get any money there to buy a car. So really, the biggest problem was getting a car. And you know, in US, a person may be homeless, but he'll have a car. And a homeless person ends up living in the car. So that is, okay, these days a lot of people travel to US or have relatives in US, but in those days there are very few. So it is difficult for people to imagine. So without a car, I really had a tough time. And very soon I came to know that thumbing a lift in US is akin to begging. So I had to each day fix up with, ring up friends, find out who was flying early morning and take a lift with them and all that. So really had a tough time. Then finally, after a few months, my brother, he was himself a student in US, but he loaned me some money and I was able to buy a second-hand car. So that was the first problem. Then the other thing was that the academic standard there was very high. You know, in those days in India, the entry level for the flying branch was metric. So I did have, I had done the Aeronautical Society exam by self-study, so I was a little better off. But the entire lot of US Air Force pilots were minimum B.Tech, majority were M.Tech, and they were M.Tech from universities like Arizona State or MIT and something. So they were
fascinating.
Better off as far as the academic standard is concerned. And well, the attitude was you come for a course, you do the course, and if you meet our standards, we pass you. If you don't meet our standards, we fail you. So that was
There was no accommodation.
no accommodation. In any case, that's fair. I mean, I'm not saying it's unfair or anything like that. So I had to work hard in all that. So I did manage, but it was quite tough. So the course was interesting, but very busy. Obviously, you had a lot to study, then a lot to fly. And the basic thing was that first you did the background theory, then you did the theory of the flight test technique, and then you flew that flight test technique, and then you had to write reports on that.
What was the fleet like of the test pilot school? So which aircraft did you get to fly when you were there?
The school itself had T-33, T-38 and 104. And just before I reached, they had two B-57s, but then they had an accident and they retired it. So for asymmetric flying, they leased Boeing 737. So asymmetric flying did on Boeing 737. Then they took us to a gliding club where we did a certain amount of gliding also. Because, and we did it at the same time that you did gliding with a normal glider, and you did gliding and forced landings on the 104. I'll come to that because that is one of the distinctive characteristics of the US Air Force school. So these were the three main aircraft. We did most of the exercise on that. Then for familiarization preview, we did various other aircraft. I flew the C-141. Then I got one flight in a B-52. That was interesting, 8-engine aircraft and all that. But I didn't qualify on the B-52. I mean, you flew with the instructor. They showed you things and you did things and all that. So these were for getting used to different aircraft. Then the two most valuable flights we had were aircraft from, it's a variable stability aircraft from CalSpan. And even today, all the test pilot school fly variable stability aircraft of CalSpan.
So if you could just take a few minutes explaining what is a variable stability aircraft for our audience who may not understand what that means.
Yeah. So what we had at that time was a B-26. It's a twin engine, the piston engine, the light bomber of Second World War. And it had analog computers. And after takeoff, you could engage that. And then you had the analog computer giving inputs and moving the control. So it was to that extent a fly-by-wire, but with analog computers. And the instructor could move the potentiometers, rheostats to get you different stability parameters.
And the objective?
Yeah, so you had two flights. One was for in the up and down, the pitching thing, and the other was the lateral direction, you yaw and roll and all that. Now, you could demonstrate normal aircraft. Then you could demonstrate neutral stability, static as well as dynamic. Then you could demonstrate instability. And that is very valuable because, when you normally fly, you don't get to see an unstable aircraft. And one lesson we learned is that unstable does not mean that it's unflyable. In fact, basic helicopter is unstable and people fly it all the time. So if aircraft is slightly unstable, you can still fly it, but it's difficult.
As a test pilot, you're likely to encounter these sorts of things. So I guess they're giving you that exposure so that you can recognize it when you see it.
Yeah, you can recognize. And for instance, in lateral direction, you get, for instance, Dutch roll. Now, what is a Dutch roll? It's interaction between the yaw and the roll, and you keep oscillating up and down. Now, in my case, I'd flown to Canberra, and high altitude, the Canberra has a Dutch roll, and it is really undamped, and it can keep on Dutch rolling. And if you can control it, but if you don't control it properly, you can increase the Dutch roll. In fact, one aircraft that was notorious for Dutch roll was the 707 transport aircraft.
Right.
So I was familiar with the Dutch roll in the Canberra, and had learned how to control it. So when this instructor showed me a Dutch roll, I controlled it. So he was amazed. He said, "Hey, how do you do it?" But then I learned something from that, because the instructor was a pilot from Calspan, and he was a guy who had done a lot of work, and he had on a contract from the USAF to write the military specification for stability and control, flying qualities of aeroplanes and all that. So he was amazed, and that, just because I had prior experience. But then we had the flight test engineer who was standing on the ladder behind, and he explained it in a different way to that engineer. He says, see this fellow? He controlled the Dutch roll by putting in a spike. And a spike is the derivative of a step. So that is, very advanced mathematics, Laplace transforms and like that.
Okay.
So then I realized that, pilots and engineers speak different languages. And obviously, you got to learn the engineer's language and be able to speak with engineers. And similarly, you have our counterparts who are flight test engineers. They are basically engineers who then get on with form a team with you to do flight testing. But they've got to learn the pilot's language and to be comfortable in the cockpit and learn about it. So this is the role, and that was a big lesson to me. So the two flights that we had on that were really useful. Calspan continues on that, and they are the leaders in all this. And all the test pilot schools train with them.
If I remember correctly, a lot of the control laws for the LCA were developed in collaboration with Calspan, isn't it?
So today they got jet aircraft. So in US, they bring their aircraft to Edwards, to the Naval Test Pilot School in Maryland. And now there's a civilian test pilot school in Mojave. Then the British and the French also take them on contract. So they fly across, take their aircraft there. Then the Indian Test Pilot School have a visit either to Europe or to USA, and they synchronize it with the Calspan schedule. So Indian test pilots also fly in the Calspan aircraft. And of course, these days, a lot of things have changed, because now, in those days, there was, digital computers were just the early mainframe computers, and the PC was not even invented. So now we have simulators and fly-by-wire, and you can set a lot of things. The world today, as far as all that is concerned, is quite different. But that's another thing about test flying. You do a basic test pilot's course, but one of the most important requirements of a test pilot is to be able to keep up with new developments and to learn on their own. Let us say, as of the time I did the test pilot's course, there were no personal computers. We used slide rules, and certain calculations we could send our data to the main base, and they would run it on the mainframe computer and give you the results back. But that was it. Then lasers were not there. so many things were not there. I mean, the world has changed, and I mean today smartphones are there, and a small smartphone does more than what a huge uh, room computer would do at that time, if at all it could
Very,
do it. I might
very true. Very true.
just digress a little bit. The first moon landing was done by Edwin Aldrin, who incidentally was my commandant at the test pilot school. And
Oh, wow.
uh, the lunar module that uh, that landed, the lander, had a computer for landing, and its memory was 64 kilobytes. Okay, 64 kilobytes today is not even talked of. It's insignificant. But that was the latest computer of the time. And in fact, the computer overloaded and he had to do a manual landing.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Uh, Coming to Aldrin, Buzz Aldrin, he was our commandant. And I got a cultural lesson very early in the early days. I fortunately reached there a week before the formal course started, and so we got a little time to settle down. So one day I went to collect my flying clothing. So as I reached there was one person at the counter, and I was standing, there was a yellow line. I was standing 4-5 feet at the yellow line waiting for my turn. Then I felt somebody standing behind me. So I looked back and I see Buzz Aldrin standing in queue behind me. He was not only my commandant, I mean, he was a world celebrity. So, I mean, in
Right.
style, I told him, sir, please go ahead. And, in India, a person like that comes, obviously he'll go to the front of the line. He declined. He just stayed in
Wow.
queue behind me. And I mean, I was his student, So he stood in line behind me and waited till I finished my work, and then only he went there. So that was a big
Fascinating.
cultural lesson.
Just 70, Roger, report type southeast, connection, for midway, and field selected.
So the F-104, what was it like to fly, and what are some of the interesting exercises that you were made to do?
Yeah, that was very interesting and very important. You say in the early days of flying, I mean, when we were cadets, for instance, single engine XT2 or T6G, or any today general aviation aircraft also, if you're on a single engine, flying club type of aircraft, then when you're flying, you're always looking out to find a suitable field to force land in case your engine fails. So back in the Air Force Flying College, in our local flying area, there were 2 or 3 designated force landing fields, and we had to practice there. And then force landing was an important part of the basic training, and your instructor would cut your engine at any time, and you had to find a field and do a practice force landing and all that. But then when the jet aircraft came, like the Vampires or Hunters and equivalent aircraft in other countries, those aircraft couldn't be force landed. Either you bailed out or ejected or whatever. And force landing went out of fashion. But the Edwards Air Force Base has got a huge lake bed. You can see it on satellite image. Huge long lake bed. And areas on that are marked, are cleared of any stones and such things. And marking is made. And they could be used as lake bed runways. I think the longest runway is 10 miles long, 15 kilometers. I landed on that. Okay, so the US Air Force pilots who were at Edwards, they continued with force landing, and they kept the art and the science alive. And you must have heard about the famous X series of aircraft. X1 was the first to break the sound barrier. They had the X2, X3, and X-15. So when I was there, the X-24 was flying, which was the lifting body. Now the big thing about this was that these aircraft would be taken up in the old days in the B-29 bomber, subsequently in the B-52, and on the pylon, and then launched at altitude, let us say 30,000 feet. And then they fired, like the X-1 did that. It was taken up in a B-29 and dropped, then fired the rocket, went supersonic, and after that did a glide landing at the Edwards Air Force Base. So now, by just putting a rocket, they were able to go exceed the speed of sound. Then very soon, by early 50s, they had gone Mach 2. All this would not have been possible if the aircraft had to take off in its own power and land back. Now, landing a high-performance aircraft, when you're coming down at a glide angle of 20 degrees or so, is quite different from landing, general aviation aircraft. So, by hard work, trial and error, theory and practice and all that, they developed the two-step approach to landing high-performance aircraft. So they come in at a high speed, much higher than the best gliding speed, and they do at about 100, 200 feet off the ground. They transition from the 20-degree glide angle to a normal 3-degree glide angle and put the landing gear down. So after that, then the landing becomes normal. What we were following in Indian Air Force, which is really copied from the British, was to do it in one step, and there be any number of landing accidents when people are doing practice force landing on hunters or any such nats and so on. So this technique they developed.
It's a bit like how the shuttle used to land, isn't it? It's what you're describing sounds like that.
I'll come to the shuttle because that's very important. So the most successful, one of the most successful of these was the X-15 program, very successful program. And it went up to Mach 7.33. That is the highest that the X-15 did. And a few of the X-15 pilots also got their astronaut wings. If you go more than a certain distance, it is treated as space. So few people got the astronaut wings on the X-15. And the X-15, every landing was a forced landing. Okay, so next was the F-104, which we flew. So I'll first describe the 104. So what the US Air Force used to do was to do the X-15 pattern on the 104. And that comes to coming overhead high key at 25,000 feet, low key at 15,000 feet. And then you come on approach, and about 300, 200 feet, you transition to the normal 3-degree angle. And as you cross 250 knots, which is the gear limiting speed, you put the landing gear down. And if you got 3 greens, well and good, you went and landed. And in an actual case, if you didn't get 3 greens, you ejected immediately. You had a split second to decide to eject if you didn't get your gear down. And then you touch down at 190 knots.
Wow, my goodness. Can you explain quickly, sir, what is a high key and medium, a low key?
See, any glider, whether it's a sailplane glider which glides or coming down to the space shuttle, which you mentioned, is of course the most famous glider, is that the glide angle depends on your lift to drag ratio. I mean, there's a slight bit of trigonometry involved in that. But basically, if your lift to drag ratio is, let us say 20:1, which is fairly normal for an average glider, and it's also the case for the Canberra or such aircraft. If it's 20:1, then you will glide at an angle of 3 degrees to the horizontal. and you can calculate the rest what it goes. So let us say you are in a good, clean aircraft and you're gliding at 3 degrees slope. So it means that now if you want to force land at a given spot at the runway, you can come at this glide angle from any distance, so maybe 10 miles, 100 miles, whatever. So the possible angles from which you can glide and successfully reach that point is a cone which starts from the ground where you want to touch down and then goes out, because as further away you are, there are some adjustments that you can make by using your spoilers or air brakes and things like that, or doing weaving, or you can also get rid of excess height by increasing the speed, in which case your lifted drag is spoiled. Now the thing is, this cone can be a straight line or it can be curved, and you can take it round. Okay, now what we normally do in flying is make a circuit. That means you, let's say, come overhead the airfield and then make a turn, go parallel to the runway, you call it the downwind leg. Then you turn 90 degrees to the runway, we call it the base leg, and then you're doing a descending turn onto the finals. So if you're very short of height, you make a direct approach and come and land. But in a direct approach, it's difficult to judge the height accurately. And if you got an ejection seat which works at ground level, you're okay, in the sense that you got your options open. But if you don't have an ejection seat and things like that, and or if your ejection seat has got limitations of 1,000 feet or whatever, and your rate of descent, then in the final stages you're committed to landing. And in a high-speed aircraft, you better not, if you're doing a forced landing, you better not be, land in rough ground, because aircraft cannot withstand that. Light aircraft
Right.
maybe. Okay, so what you do is you come overhead, and the concept of a high key is that you're on downwind at a particular height that you want. And if you are too high, then you do a slightly wider pattern. If you are low, then you cut the corner so that, okay, you're not made a high key, so you cut the corner and try and make the low key. And well, let's say aircraft like Vampire, where forced landing was done and practiced. So the idea was that if you're not correctly positioned at low key, then at least in a fighter and all that, you eject. So you better be correctly positioned at low key. And low key is really the end of downwind, where you commence your turn onto base leg and the final. Okay.
Right.
So we did a lot of this on the 104, including touch and go landings of that. And so the forced landing pattern and actual touchdowns of that, because that is the proof of the pudding. We did a lot, and that is a very large part of the exercise. Okay, now when I was there, the space shuttle was in the development stage, and there was a lot of debate that a lot of the people who developed the space shuttle, they wanted to install some 3 or 4 jet engines in the shuttle, so that when it came in for landing, if the landing approach was not good, the jet engines would enable it to go around and try another approach.
Wow, fascinating. Okay.
Okay. Now the thing about carrying jet engine on a space shuttle is that the engine, the associated accessories and fuel tank and fuel pump and that entire system would have to be launched from here, taken to orbit and brought back. So let us say the whole thing was a few thousand pounds. So it reduced your payload by so much. But the USAF Force test pilots who had regularly kept the art of forced landings alive in high performance aircraft, like coming in at 20 degrees angle, 20 degrees to a layman sounds difficult. I mean, doesn't sound too much, but a pilot who really does a 20-degree dive, it's very steep. I mean, normal approach is 3 degrees. So it is, almost 7 times as steep. So finally, the test pilots were able to convince NASA that it's not necessary to have the jet engines for go round, and we can successfully and confidently land the space shuttle just like we've been landing the X-15 and all the other aircraft. In fact, the glide angle of the space shuttle is 17 or 18 degrees. It's in fact slightly better than the X-15, which came in at 20 degrees. Okay, so now what they do in the space shuttle, they have given some aids. First, they have an ILS, which is set to the glide angle of the space shuttle. And also, you might recall in between, the Americans had developed a microwave landing system, which is supposed to replace the ILS. It's got a lot of features which are more advanced than the ILS. But then the ILS improved, so the MLS is not so much in use, but they've got microwave landing system also. The thing about a microwave landing, see, the ILS can guide you in a certain fixed direction only, whereas the microwave landing system allows you to do a curved approach and things like that. And when you come in on the steep glide, which is used for the space shuttle or X-series aircraft and all that. So when you're coming in at the glide of 20 degrees or so, you have to aim for a certain point before your intended landing. Because after that, when you transition to a normal 3-degree slope, it's a continuous reduction in speed after that. It's really coasting along to that next place. So you have to aim for a spot which is well before the runway. So if you look at a satellite map of satellite picture of Edwards main runway, or you look at the Cape Canaveral Kennedy Space Center base, they have put a large marker on the ground. If you have a look, you will find a marker. I'm not sure whether it is a square or a circle, but there's definitely an aim point for the space shuttle. Because the space shuttle main landing is at Cape Canaveral, but if the weather there is bad, it lands at alternative Edwards, and then it is ferried across in a 747. So by maintaining or keeping alive this art of the forced landing of high-performance aircraft, the Americans went far ahead of the Europeans and Russians in astronautics and space and all that. And even today, they are the only ones really with the space shuttle.
So if you can come to, so when you came back to India, you were involved with test flying and then set up the test pilot school. What was that like?
Yeah, so now that's a different new story altogether. Related to this. Now, as I told you, I had in spite of being, having done the Aeronautical Society exam, and which is equivalent in engineering degree, and so it is really equivalent to BTech, which is far ahead of what the average pilot in Indian Air Force had at that time. I had a tough time learning all the academics and ground subjects at Edwards. Well, the USAF pilots also had a tough time, to be fair. It's really, they really rammed a lot of things down our throat. But I felt that any person who goes for the course after me should get a lot of pre-course training here. Because, I spent a lot of my time learning maths and, all control systems and a lot of things which are really, for an engineer, they're basic. So it didn't get so much time to learn some of the latest developments that were taking place over there. And I felt that if a person got good pre-course training, the only pre-course training I got before I went was to fly a few aircraft, like Hunter and Kiran and all that, which I had not flown before. And it gave me an introduction to single engine, fighters and all that. But AST did not, really prepare me for the ground subjects. So when I came back, I was determined to help any future student who goes. So that is the frame of mind that I came back in. And when I came back, to my surprise, I found that Air Headquarters had reorganized AST and added a test pilot school. And a little history to that. At that time, we had very few test pilots in India. And most of them opposed the idea of having a test pilot school here for whatever reason, because they felt that if we run a test pilot course here, we would stagnate, we would not learn the latest developments. Whereas if you went abroad, you learned some of the latest developments in aviation. So my counter to that was that you run test pilots course here, but have exchange students and have exchange instructors, just like you have in staff college or NDC or anything like that. And so you can keep up with the latest developments. Now,
Right.
so Air Headquarters is really pushing AST to run the test pilots course. Fortunately, the Air Headquarters are already sanctioned, and AST was running a precursor to a test pilots course. They called it the flight inspectors course, which was limited. I mean, we did a few basics and a few basic exercises. We had very few test pilots at that time, and not a single flight test engineer. One flight test engineer was trained along with Rajkumar, so parallel to me about the same time. And so the lesson I brought back from US is that quantity in education is as important as quality. So I had two things joining together. One is my desire to help any future people who go to test pilots course abroad. And second is to have quantity in education. So this fitted in with what Air Headquarters was putting in. So when I joined, there were three of us. As I told you, the future Air Chief Krishnaswamy, Rajkumar, myself. The three of us joined, and we were all three fresh out of test pilot school from three different countries. So, we had a lot of notes to compare and all that. But we were thrown in, and we had to do, things like, at the test pilot schools, you learn how to basically test an aircraft, but you don't learn how to plan a flight test program. That requires fair amount of experience, what to do, what test you should do first, and what test can wait a little longer. Because, the whole thing is very interlinked. Because when you start with a new aircraft, there's so many unknowns. And especially in those early days, almost 50 years back, computers and all were not there. In fact, I was the first one to buy a calculator for the Indian Air Force. And that calculator, you'd be surprised, my commandant had to send a dual letter to the controller of defense accounts, who had been his classmate at the National Defense College, to get special sanction to buy the calculator. And that calculator, by the way, it was an XCL calculator. It cost 72,000 rupees. So the first
my goodness.
72,000 rupees 50 years back is worth several lakhs today. But that was a huge improvement over a slide rule. So anyway, I took interest in training. So I was made the OC Test Pilot School. And OC Test Pilot School meant myself, nothing else. I'm not even a table and chair anyway. But I took interest. And I'm glad to say that I trained a few people, like our cosmonaut Ravish Malhotra, and later Scholar, later Marshal Kala. So when these people went for the test pilots course to Britain or to US or France or wherever, they went with some training, some background. And mind you, other countries also, when I did the course, the Italian who was with me had spent 1 full year at his test center before coming. There was an Israeli guy in the course before me. He had also spent 1 full year at his flight test center. He had done a lot of things. So people were praising him, he's very good, this, that. But the fellow had done 1 full year at his test center. He had flown with test pilots. He had studied the ground subjects. So he came, fully prepared.
Right.
So by getting onto the test pilot school and taking interest, I was able to train a few people in the basics, things like report writing and the basic theory, maths, some flying lessons, all that. So they went prepared and they had a much easier time than I had. We moved from Kanpur to Bangalore and we started a little more advanced course called the Production Test Pilots course. It's a 5-month course. And we selected few people. So the other cosmonaut of us, Rakesh Sharma, he was one of the early graduates of the test pilot school. So, I can proudly say that both the cosmonauts are my students. One thing I had learned in the test pilot school was how much advanced instrumentation you have is that, but you still got to take your notes on a knee pad or record it into a voice recorder, and your impressions and what you do. And also we had exercises of testing a plane without any special instrumentation. So that was very important because, in the USAF context, it was like if they capture some, aircraft from the other side of the curtain, and now they got to fly it. So you got no flight manual, no nothing, but you fly it. So they're very fond of doing that. In our context, it's more a case of are people going on evaluation in case you're trying to buy some aircraft or something like that. So then you get to fly a limited number of flights, but without special instrumentation or telemetry or something like that. So you got to be having, looking around and keeping very observant of that. Mm-hmm. So when we started with basically no instrumentation, special instrumentation, using the aircraft instruments. And the only special things that we had was a knee pad and a stopwatch, so you could carry that. And we did that, and I'm very proud to say that my students from the early batches have done well. 2 cosmonauts, I told you, both the cosmonauts. And but soon after we established it, the Navy came to know of what we were doing, and so they asked for a vacancy, and we got then Lieutenant Commander Arun Prakash, who later on became the naval chief. So one of my star students, and so that was an endorsement by the Navy of what we were doing.
Right.
Just need 70, Roger, report IP Southeast, connection, for midways, and you will select it.
Since I've taken a lot of your time today, but before I let you go, if you can talk about your ejection in the Iskra, what was the flight like, and what happened, and what was that experience like?
The Kirin is a Polish aircraft, and we had them in Hakimpet. And it's fairly normal for an aircraft after it enters service for something to happen which was not exposed in the flight testing. Like the British had that experience with the Hunter. They did all the spin trials and all that, but in service, they started having problems, and they had a special spin program for that. The Americans faced it with the F4 Phantom. Again, it did a thorough flight test program, and in service they had problems, and they ran a flight test program for the Phantom. Now we had a similar experience in the Kirin. It's actually before the Iskra. We did HL and Air Force did all the spin testing, 8-turn spins, this, that, all that sort of thing. And the conclusion with the Kirin was that it's impossible to put it into an inverted spin. But in 1974 or 75, at AFA, an instructor and people got into an inverted spin. So then it was referred to us, and our then Chief Test Pilot, Wing Commander Dale, later Air Marshal, he did some flights and he was able to replicate that and get it into an inverted spin and all that. So what I'm saying, it is fairly normal, or shall we say, not unexpected for an aircraft in service to be doing things which had not gone earlier. So a test pilot's job starts from the time an aircraft is conceived, thought of in the design stage, and it goes on right as long as the aircraft is in service. Obviously, you're not involved on day-to-day basis, but problems are referred from time to time. So the Iskra experienced problems and the delayed recovery from spin. By that time, I had switched over from the test pilot school to the flight test squadron. And when these problems came up, then Wing Commander Jayal, my chief test pilot, he was scheduled to go for the spin trials. But then suddenly he was pulled out and sent for a court of inquiry to Sulur. So he went for that inquiry. So then, I was caught and sent to Hakimpet to do these spin trials. So I went there and I did a few flights with one of the instructors there to firstly familiarize with the aircraft and the spinning characteristics. And the biggest problem I had, well, really two problems, but interlinked, was that I had nobody to come and discuss a debrief after the test, discuss what happened, why this, why that. And those days, if you had to talk to base, you had to book a call and you just about got 3 minutes or 4 minutes to talk to somebody at base. So the biggest handicap I felt, I didn't have another test pilot or test engineer to talk to because we were very short of people. There was just nobody. Today, if a test like this is done, you will have two test pilots there, or you'll have a test pilot and a test engineer with whom you can discuss things. So each day I used to do the spin trials. No, initially they were not trials, they were familiarization sorties with the instructor. I used to ring up my commandant back home because my immediate boss, the chief test pilot, had gone on the court of inquiry. So it went on and this and that. Then one day with the instructor, the Iskra had a little unusual. It had a spin which was very steep, and it used to, in that case, come out of the spin by itself. It would transition to a spiral and the speed would increase and you recovered from that, no problem. But on that day, from a steep spin, it transitioned to a flat spin. And the Iskra had what is called an agada, which is a artificial horizon attitude indicator, which could give you the angles, which today most do, but this is now 45 years back.
Right. Most Soviet aircraft, I think, have the Agata, right?
The Soviet fighters, the MiGs had it. So the normal spin, you had a very steep spin down 50, 60 degrees angle down. But then it transitioned by itself to a flat spin. The nose was just 15 degrees below the horizon, and it transitioned to a flat spin. Now, a flat spin is difficult to recover from, but I found that it recovered without any difficulty. So then finished all that, landed back, and I reported this to my commandant. And then between the two of us, we decided that, okay, you did enter a... see, I mean, I'll need a piece of paper and all that to explain the theory behind it, but you can have an aircraft with different spin modes, the same aircraft depending on conditions where it spins steep or it spins flat. So we decided to continue with the trials because air headquarters had said it's highly urgent, all that sort of thing. Okay, in hindsight, we should have stopped the trials right there. And that would have been a feather in our cap because we had found the cause and we had found the flat spin. And then we could have reviewed the whole situation and decided what to do. Now, the next day, the familiarization part was over. So there was an aircraft which had been giving trouble, tail number 1762. So next day, we said, okay, we'll take that up to see. The instructor who had been assigned to me, he was a wise person. He said, look, in this aircraft, because he had the trouble in that aircraft. He says, in this aircraft, I'm not coming. So wise guy, he didn't come. So I went solo on that. I did one or two.
How did you initiate the exercise?
It is all on kilometers, but I would say around 25 or 30,000 feet. Okay, so you start with stalls, and then with little post-stall thing that, at the stall you put in a little rudder and recover soon after that, quarter turn, half turn, things like that. And then I did a spin to the left, I think 2 turns and recovered okay. Then I did a spin to the right, and this time it went into a flat spin and would not recover. So, okay, I mean, it kept on spinning and tried all that and didn't work.
Were you being thrown around in the cockpit at this time?
No, it's a flat spin, no? And flat spin is not very violent. You see, you can have a flat sort of steady spin. You can have an oscillatory spin. A little bit of an oscillatory spin is actually easier to recover from because the speed of rotation varies and it goes up and down and things like that. But in a flat spin, it's steady and more difficult to recover. So this was in a flat spin. So it was not violent and all that. So anyway, and another unfortunate thing was that in that particular aircraft, the RT, the radio telephone, was not working well. So when I gave a call, I'm going to eject and all that, not clearly gone to the ATC. So when I ejected, they were not sure what happened, and I was missing rather than they being sure of what happened. Northeast of Hakimpet, there's a village now, maybe a small town called Rajapet, and little closer to Rajapet is a village called Palpuli. So I landed there. Okay, that parachute descent was my one and only parachute descent. The ejection seat was very similar to the Canberra seat. You had to manually push the seat away and separate and all that. And the surprise I got when I looked up was that I got a square parachute. So, I thought all parachutes were down. Coming down in the parachute, I had a good view. But, that part of place, Deccan Plateau, is got a lot of boulders and all that. So landing on a boulder is not very, not going to be a pleasant experience. So I came down. I tried to steer the parachute. Obviously, I didn't know how to do that. And I was heading for some electric wires. Luckily, I missed that. And to my good fortune, I landed in a flooded paddy field, which was,
boy.
and it cushioned my fall. So, to my good luck, I did not land on a boulder or I did not land on electric wires. You can land on an electric wire. You had friends who landed on trees. You can be stuck on the tree. I had a friend who ejected from Tezpur, and he landed the jungle, forest, and I'm not very sure. I think he had to spend a full night over there till he was rescued and all that. So it
Holy
can
cow,
be
yeah.
a lot of things. So my good luck that I landed in a flooded paddy field, which cushioned my fall. I had done a tenure in the paratroopers training school, so I knew something about parachutes. It was monsoon time. The wind was 20 knots, almost 35 kilometers per hour. And this parachute was dragging me. There was a water pump over there, a well and a water pump, which had pumped the water to the paddy field. So the villagers there, they were really treated to a spectacle, somebody coming down in the parachute and landing in the paddy field and then struggling with the parachute. It was a tug of war, pulling the other direction. And I knew the technique of spilling the wind from a parachute. You have to pull the cords which are on the ground so that you tip the parachute over and it no longer catches the wind. But that didn't work. So then I had to do the next thing of releasing my harness. You have to release the harness and roll in the ground so that the wind and the parachute pull the harness away from you. So I did that. I undid the harness and I rolled. So by now I had rolled in the mud paddy field. And
Oh my goodness.
so I was looking quite a sight. But anyway, now the parachute. So they had seen a tug of war between the parachute and me, and suddenly the parachute collapsed and the tug of war is over. So anyway, they took me and there was the water pump for the irrigation. And so the outlet was about 3-4 feet above the ground, big pipe, I think 3-inch pipe or something like that with water. So they washed me in that like a buffalo. And then one wise old woman came to me and she said, this is the first day of your new life. So
that's very perceptive and touching.
it's a very prophetic statement. Anyway, now that place, those days was very primitive. There was no telephone connection, no telegraph connection, nothing. I mean, I couldn't send a message home. Like you're in the back of beyond nowhere. As a group, we walked and they showed me where my aircraft had crashed. Then from there, we came to walk till Rajapet village, and they treated me to coffee and some snacks and all that. And then, as per our drill, if you eject or do a parachute jump, then what you do is you lay your parachute on the ground so that the rescue aircraft can sight you.
Right.
These aircraft flew around. I could see them flying above, but they didn't sight me. So I ejected at about 8:45 in the morning, but waited around till about 5 o'clock and they still hadn't found me. So one guy offered to drop me. There's a highway from Secunderabad to Warangal. He said, I'll drop you there on the motorcycle. And there was no proper road. It was all track. his motorcycle had no shock absorbers. But anyway, I was grateful for the ride. He gave me a ride a few kilometers. There was no post office, no telegraph office, no police station, nothing. So India was so backward at that time. Okay, they did have electricity and that water pump had pumped. So he dropped me at the police station on that highway. I went to the police station and I told the guy over there the situation. And to my surprise, that police guy, he refused to send a message to, I told him to send a message to your headquarters secretariat so that they relayed to the Air Force to say that I'm here and I'm safe and all that. He refused to send a message. He said, send it from your aircraft radio. Look, I've ejected and the aircraft has crashed and it's got fire. It's got no radio left. And then I had to assert myself. I said, look, I'm a government officer and you better send that message. And if you don't send it, I will report you to the Director General of Police and then we'll see what happens to you. So then he came to his senses and he ordered some coffee for me. And then what he did is you had these buses, deluxe buses going down. He stopped the bus and told the driver and conductor to drop me in Hyderabad. So he did me that service, which was his duty. I mean, not this thing. But I was surprised, I mean, him telling me to use my radio. But fortunately, right from cadet days, we had been trained to always carry, at least in peacetime, to carry an identity card and a purse with some cash. So I was able to pay for my bus ticket. So I came back to Hyderabad on that bus. And then I took an auto to a friend's house. And then he drove me and dropped me in Begumpet, Hakimpet.
Wow, what a fascinating story.
Just need 7D, like your import type southeast connection, for some way, and you'll still like this.
I wanted to talk to you about an incident that you had in 1976, I think, in a Marut.
Yeah.
And that was with my father, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I have a connection with your father. I had the privilege of serving under him.
Right.
In AST. So in February 76, he was posted in. And he had just come from commanding a mixed cotton at in
Tezpur.
What we call the Far East Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
So came there and I just did a refresher flight with him on the Marut trainer.
Mm-hmm.
He was already qualified on it, far more experienced than me.
Mm-hmm.
This is just a refresher for him to just get his hand in.
Right.
And now the Marut has got a nosewheel system. It's got a steerable nosewheel,
Mm-hmm.
but that is not always connected to your rudder. It is connected only when you engage it, and we don't use it for takeoff and landing. It's only for taxiing. There's a switch which you put on and then it engages.
Oh, fascinating. Okay.
Okay, so that is basically only for taxiing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the nose landing gear, when it is raised, it goes forward and up.
Mm-hmm.
And then in order to fit that little space in the nose,
Mm-hmm.
The wheel is turned at 90 degrees so that it becomes horizontal instead of going up vertically
Right.
into the space. They found some space and it turns 90 degrees and goes up.
Okay.
Now, when you bring it down, obviously the reverse sequence happens.
Mm-hmm.
As it comes down, it turns through 90 degrees and comes parallel fore and aft.
Right.
Now, there have been problems in the Marut when it comes down, it doesn't align itself properly, and you get the nose wheel cocked to the right, let us say at 30 or 45 degrees.
Oh,
And
boy.
you have no indication in the cockpit. You don't even know.
Oh.
You only come to know after landing, and you land on the main wheels, and the nose is up. As the speed drops, the nose wheel drops. As the nose wheel drops, normally you go straight. But if it is cocked, then it swerves off to the right.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
Dad and me, he was in the front seat and I was at the rear. So it swerved off and went off the runway. This is the first and only time I've gone off the runway in aircraft.
Wow.
And it so happened that, at the HL airport runway, there is a stormwater drain parallel to the runway. And that is quite deep, and it is lined with stones and concrete. And I presume it is more than the specified distance away, but it was quite a hazard. And to our good luck, the aircraft was going in an arc to the right. And just at one spot, there's a culvert for the small road that crosses the runway. So just at that culvert, we crossed that ditch, and landing gear sheared off, but nothing more than that happened. And if in that entire length of the stormwater drain, if it had been a little ahead or a little to the back, things could have been quite different. Anyway, when past that, the landing gear sheared off and we stopped. And then your dad did not jettison the canopy, he opened it. And that caused a bit of a problem in the sense that if the canopy is fully closed, you can jettison it. But if you open it, then you can't jettison it. He, as a good single-seat pilot, he opened it, and when it crossed his head, he stopped it. It's a switch that is off, and then one side you press, it opens, the other side you press, it closes. Sliding canopy. So then I had to, tell him, very quietly, sir, please open it a little more so that I can also come out. So anyway, he opened it fully and I got out. And both of us got out. Luckily, there was no further problem on that.
Okay.
So that was one, a narrow miss. Fortunately, we were okay, and the aircraft was what they call Cat B, or repairable and all that.
It's been over 2 hours. I've taken a lot of your time. I just can't thank you enough for being so generous with the time and being so detailed and candid with the experiences that you've gone through. I want to thank you for doing that, as well as to thank you for your service and for all the time that you've spent with me today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ganesh. It was a pleasure.
report time southeast, connection for midway, and you'll still like this.
Well, folks, that's all we have time for this week. Join us again next week. In the meantime, sign up for updates at blueskiespodcast.com. There you'll find links to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also write to us with your comments, questions, suggestions, and feedback from the website or to blueskies@prganapati.com. Subscribe to the podcast on any podcasting platform such as Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and even on YouTube. If you like what you heard, share it with your friends, give us a rating in your favorite podcasting app, and write us a review. It will help other people find us. I want to give my thanks to Saurav Chaudia for our logo and Prithvik for the music. I want to reiterate that all the views expressed here are personal, and this podcast has not been approved by or reviewed by the Air Force, Ministry of Defense, or any branch of the government. In the meantime, stay safe and Jai Hind.